For 2 millennia, Christian relics have been the object of passionate worship and a source of untold riches. The remains of saints, fragments of Christ's cross, the swaddling clothes of the Virgin Mary. These sacred objects determined the fate of empires and guided the flow of pilgrims. But what was happening behind the scenes of piety? What secrets does the multi-billion-dollar relic trade industry hide? Modern science ruthlessly exposes the fakes accumulated over centuries, but millions of believers continue to seek healing from dubious relics. Welcome to a world where faith collides with evidence, and the sacred intertwines with the commercial. This is the story of how the trade in bones became one of the most profitable enterprises of the Middle Ages, and remains a mystery to this day. If this story has made you think about the boundaries between faith and critical thinking, subscribe to our channel and give us a thumbs up. We explore the most controversial pages of human history, where religion, politics, and big money intertwine. Now, write your opinion in the comments. Should the modern church honestly acknowledge the medieval origins of most relics, or is it more important to preserve people's faith in their miraculous power? Can a relic be genuine and help people, even if science proves it to be fake? At the end of the 2nd century AD, events took place in the catacombs of Rome that forever changed the face of Christianity. It was here, among the underground corridors and burial chambers, that a tradition was born which, over the centuries, would turn into a multi-million-dollar industry trading in relics. Early Christians treated the bodies of martyrs in a very special way. For them, the remains of those who died for their faith were not just bones, but conduits of divine power. The first references to the veneration of relics are found in The Martyrdom of Polycarp, written around 155 AD. The believers of Smyrna carefully collected the remains of their bishop after his execution, declaring that these bones were more precious than jewels and purer than gold. This attitude was radically different from the Jewish and pagan traditions of the time. Judaism considered touching a dead body to be defilement, and the Romans preferred cremation. Christians, however, saw relics as a source of healing and protection. They believed that the divine grace that permeated the saint during his lifetime continued to work through his remains after death. The first Christian communities organized secret meetings at the tombs of martyrs. These meetings took place in deep secrecy, as Christianity remained a forbidden religion. Believers brought the sick to the relics, prayed for healing, and asked for protection from persecution. Gradually, a ritual developed that included reading the lives of the saints, communal prayers, and touching the relics. By the 3rd century, the cult of relics was already firmly established in Christian tradition. Bishop Cyprian of Carthage described in detail in his letters the miracles that took place at the tombs of martyrs. He told of the blind who regained their sight from touching the holy bones, of the lame who began to walk, and of the possessed who were healed. These testimonies, recorded by contemporaries, became the basis for the theological justification of the veneration of relics. However, even at an early stage, doubts arose about the authenticity of some relics. Christian writers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries mention cases when unscrupulous merchants tried to sell fake remains of saints. This indicates that even then there was a demand for relics, which means that the first fakes appeared. The reign of Emperor Constantine the Great was a turning point. After the Edict of Milan in 313, Christianity gained official status, and the veneration of relics came out of hiding. Constantine personally searched for the relics of the Passion of Christ in Jerusalem. His mother, Empress Helena, undertook the famous journey to the Holy Land, where, according to legend, she discovered the life-giving cross. Helena's discovery of the cross became a model for subsequent searches for relics. The empress not only found wooden fragments of the cross, but also the nails with which Christ was crucified. She ordered one of these nails to be forged into Constantine's helmet and the other into his horse's bridle. These actions demonstrated a practical understanding of the power of relics as protective amulets. With the official recognition of Christianity, a new stage in the development of the cult of relics began. The Church was able to openly preach the belief in the miraculous power of holy remains, but at the same time faced the need to control this process. Even then, some church hierarchs understood the danger of forgeries and abuses associated with the trade in relics. But it was already impossible to stop the process that had begun. The cult of relics was gaining strength, and with it grew the temptation to profit from the holy objects. It soon became clear that the pious intentions of the early Christians would turn into one of the most profitable industries of the medieval economy. After Emperor Constantine founded a new capital on the shores of the Bosphorus in 330, Constantinople became a magnet for relics from all over the Christian world. The new capital of the empire was to eclipse pagan Rome, not only in political grandeur, but also in spiritual significance. This required relics. Many relics. Constantine and his successors launched a veritable hunt for relics. Imperial agents combed the provinces, buying up and requisitioning holy objects from local Christian communities. Within a few decades, Constantinople had amassed a collection that could rival the most ancient Christian centers. It housed pieces of the life-giving cross, the crown of thorns, Longinus's spear, and the sponge used to give Christ water on the cross. The palace church of Hagia Sophia, where the most valuable relics were kept, occupied a special place. The emperors understood that possession of the relics meant possession of divine protection. Each important relic was placed in a precious reliquary decorated with gold and precious stones. The cost of some reliquaries exceeded the annual budget of entire provinces. But Constantinople was not the only center for the accumulation of holy relics. Rome, having lost its political primacy, redoubled its efforts to collect relics in order to maintain its spiritual leadership. The popes systematically collected relics in the catacombs of the city, transferred them to basilicas, and created veritable treasuries of holy objects. By the 5th century, there were more than 300 churches in Rome, each with its own relics. Competition between Constantinople and Rome gave rise to the first serious doubts about the authenticity of relics. When heads of John the Baptist appeared in both capitals, church hierarchs faced a delicate problem: how to explain to believers the existence of two heads of one saint. Theologians got out of the situation by claiming that one head belonged to John as a baby, and the other to the adult martyr. Similar incidents multiplied with each passing decade. Dozens of nails from the cross of Christ, hundreds of fragments of the life-giving tree, and many swaddling clothes of the Virgin Mary appeared in Europe. Mathematically savvy skeptics calculated that if all the fragments of the cross stored in various churches were collected, they would form a forest the size of a small grove. The trade in relics began to generate enormous profits. Pilgrims from all over the empire flocked to Constantinople and Rome to worship at the shrines. They left generous donations, bought souvenirs, and paid for accommodation and food. The economies of both capitals received a powerful boost. The church authorities soon realized that relics could be used not only to attract pilgrims, but also as diplomatic gifts. fragments of relics became a kind of currency in relations between Christian rulers. Byzantine emperors presented their allies with pieces of holy relics in exchange for political support. The popes of Rome were not far behind in this practice. They sent relics to the newly converted peoples of Europe, thus strengthening the authority of the Roman Church. Every new church had to have relics to consecrate the altar. The demand for relics grew exponentially, and supply could not keep up. By the 7th century, stable trade routes had been established for transporting sacred objects. Venice became the main transshipment point for the trade in relics between the East and the West. Venetian merchants quickly realized the profitability of this business and established regular deliveries of relics from Byzantium to Western Europe. Gradually, a complex hierarchy of relics developed. The most valuable were the relics of Christ and the Virgin Mary, followed by the apostles, then the martyrs of the first centuries, with local saints at the bottom of the list. The prices of relics depended on their rating in this hierarchy. A finger of an apostle could buy several villages, and a hair of the Virgin Mary could buy an entire estate. But the most surprising thing was that many relics had the ability to reproduce themselves. Particles of relics separated from the main body of the saint retained all their miraculous power. This theological position opened up unlimited possibilities for the reproduction of relics, and it soon became clear that this feature would turn holy relics into one of the most controversial issues in the Christian world. By the 8th century, the Christian Church realized that holy relics were not just objects of worship, but powerful political weapons. Those who controlled the most significant relics gained leverage over believers, rulers, and entire nations. An era began when holy relics became a bargaining chip in high politics. Pope Stephen II was the first to fully exploit the potential of relics for political purposes. In 754, when the Lombards threatened the papal possessions, he did not rely solely on diplomacy. Instead, the pontiff organized a solemn procession with the relics of the Apostle Peter through the streets of Rome. Thousands of believers, seeing the relic in mortal danger, rose up against the invaders. The success of the Roman operation did not go unnoticed. Soon, relics began to be used as a tool for mobilizing the masses throughout Europe. When the Vikings threatened English monasteries, monks carried the relics of saints to the walls of fortresses. It was believed that the saints personally protected their remains from desecration by pagans. The political role of relics was particularly evident during conflicts between secular and ecclesiastical authorities. Emperor Leo III Esau, who launched an iconoclastic campaign in Byzantium, encountered unexpected resistance. Defenders of icons used relics as proof that material objects could carry divine grace. If the relics of saints were miraculous, they argued, then their images also possessed sacred power. The iconoclastic crisis, which lasted more than a century, divided Byzantine society. Supporters of icon veneration organized secret gatherings at relics, turning the worship of relics into a form of political protest. Iconoclastic emperors, realizing the danger, tried to confiscate the most revered relics, but this only intensified popular outrage. The Western Church closely followed events in Byzantium and learned its own lessons. The popes understood that control over relics meant control over the minds of believers. Systematic work began to concentrate the most significant shrines in the hands of the Roman Curia. Papal legates combed through Europe, exchanging and buying relics from local churches. Charlemagne was the first secular ruler to fully realize the political potential of shrines. When he was crowned emperor in 800, he demanded that the ceremony be held in the presence of as many relics as possible. The Aachen Chapel housed relics from dozens of European monasteries. In this way, the new emperor received the blessing of all Christian saints. Charlemagne's successors went even further. They began to collect relics in their residences, turning the imperial chapels into veritable museums of holy objects. Every important political decision was made in the presence of relics, which gave secular power a sacred character. The subjects saw the emperor not only as a ruler, but as God's chosen one, surrounded by heavenly intercessors. However, the use of relics for political purposes had a downside. The more actively relics were used as an instrument of power, the more doubts arose about their authenticity. Skeptical contemporaries wondered, if relics really possess divine power, why can't they protect themselves from manipulation? Particularly heated discussions arose around the practice of dividing relics. The church authorities claimed that any fragment of a saint's relics retained its full miraculous power. This allowed relics to be divided endlessly, creating new holy objects for political needs. Critics pointed out the absurdity of a situation where one saint had enough relics to equip an entire army. Relic traders quickly adapted to the political demand for shrines. They offered rulers exclusive relics that guaranteed victory in battle, protection from conspiracies, and divine support for the dynasty. The prices for such relics reached astronomical heights, but politicians were willing to pay any amount of money for heavenly protection. By the end of the first millennium, a paradoxical situation had developed. Relics, which originally symbolized renunciation of worldly things, became a tool in the struggle for worldly power. Holy relics became weapons in the hands of ecclesiastical and secular rulers, and their authenticity was increasingly questioned. Soon, these doubts would lead to scandals that would shake the foundations of medieval Christianity. The 11th century was marked by a veritable explosion in the trade in holy relics throughout Europe. What began as a pious tradition of venerating martyrs turned into a highly profitable business, generating profits comparable to those from trading in gold and spices. Relics became commodities, and these commodities were in incredible demand. Large cities at the crossroads of trade routes became centers of trade in holy relics. Venice, Genoa, Paris, and Cologne turned into a kind of relic exchange, where merchants from all over the continent traded sacred remains. Prices were set based on the rarity of the relics, their origin, and their reputation for miraculous powers. The medieval relic market was based on simple economic logic. Every new church needed relics to consecrate its altar, as required by church canons. The number of saints was limited, while the number of churches grew exponentially. The shortage led to high prices, and high prices stimulated supply, sometimes of very dubious origin. Monasteries turned into veritable factories for the production and processing of relics. Monks not only stored relics, but also engaged in their reproduction. The practice of dividing relics reached unprecedented proportions. A single finger of a saint could be divided into dozens of fragments, each of which was sold as an independent relic, with a full set of miraculous properties. The production of contact relics was particularly profitable. Any object that came into contact with the saint's relics automatically acquired sacred properties. Fabrics applied to the remains, oil with which the reliquaries were anointed, even dust from the tombs of saints. All this became a commodity on the religious market. Relic merchants developed sophisticated marketing strategies. They spread stories about miracles that happened thanks to their goods, organized demonstrative healings, and attracted witnesses to confirm the authenticity of the relics. Some merchants employed entire teams of agents who studied the needs of different regions and selected suitable relics. A special niche was occupied by named relics, the relics of saints, who were particularly revered in specific areas. Merchants carefully studied local traditions and offered precisely those relics that were in greatest demand. For France, these were the relics of Saint Martin of Tours, for England, Thomas Becket, and for Germany, Boniface. Relic fairs became regular events in large cities. At these events, merchants displayed their goods, priests conducted authenticity checks, and buyers could compare the prices and quality of various relics. The atmosphere of the fairs resembled modern trade shows, except that the goods were sacred remains. The church hierarchy tried to control the trade in relics, but without success. The scale of the business exceeded the administrative capabilities of the medieval church. Papal bulls prohibiting the sale of relics were regularly ignored. The local clergy was often interested in trade, as it generated significant income. Gradually, an entire industry of counterfeiting developed. Workshops for the manufacture of fake relics operated in many European cities. Skilled craftsmen created ancient bones, aged fabrics, and produced fake documents confirming the authenticity of the relics. The quality of some of the fakes was so high that only experts could detect the deception. Relics associated with the Passion of Christ were particularly popular. Fragments of the cross, nails from the crucifixion, the crown of thorns, all of these were sold in huge quantities. Mathematically savvy critics calculated that if all the nails from Christ's cross sold in medieval Europe were collected, there would be enough to crucify an entire army. The trade in relics also gave rise to new forms of fraud. Some enterprising businessmen discovered new saints, manufactured their relics, and distributed hagiographies describing their miracles. Since the canonization procedure was not yet fully formalized, such machinations often went unpunished. By the end of the 11th century, the trade in holy relics had reached such proportions that it began to influence the economies of entire regions. Cities that possessed famous relics prospered from pilgrimages and trade. But at the same time, the number of skeptics grew, who asked themselves, do heavenly powers really need commercial mediation? The year 1054 was a turning point in the history of the cult of holy relics. It was then that a scandal occurred that for the first time caused the general public to doubt the authenticity of the relics. In the city of Tournai, local authorities accused monks from a neighboring abbey of selling fake remains of Saint Eleutherius. When the relics were examined, it turned out that the holy bones belonged to an ordinary sheep. The case gained widespread publicity, as the relics of Saint Eleutherius had been bringing the abbey enormous income for several years. Pilgrims from all over northern France flocked to worship the relics, leaving generous donations. The exposure called into question not only the reputation of the particular monastery, but the entire system of trading in relics. The church authorities tried to hush up the scandal, but the information had already spread throughout Europe. Educated people began to ask uncomfortable questions. If monks who had taken a vow of honesty were capable of such deception, what could be trusted? How many more sacred sheep bones were being passed off as the remains of holy martyrs? The scandal in Tours was only the tip of the iceberg. Soon, similar cases of forgery began to come to light throughout Europe. In Rome, the trade in fake fragments of the cross of Christ was exposed. It turned out that enterprising businessmen made them from ordinary wooden slats, which they then aged with special compounds. The case of the relics of St. James in Compostela was particularly high profile. When the authorities decided to transfer the remains to a new reliquary, it was discovered that the tomb contained the bones of at least 7 different people from different eras. Expert analysis showed that some of the relics of St. James were made from animal bones and even from polished stones. The scandals multiplied like an avalanche. In Cologne, merchants were exposed for selling hair of the Virgin Mary made from horsehair. In Paris, a workshop was discovered where fake crucifixion nails were made from ordinary iron. In Venice, a group of relic counterfeiters was arrested, who had flooded Europe with thousands of fake relics over 10 years of work. The church hierarchy found itself in an extremely delicate position. On the one hand, it was necessary to combat counterfeits in order to preserve the authority of the institution of relics. On the other hand, too active a fight against fakes could cast doubt on the authenticity of all relics, including those kept in the main temples of Christianity. Pope Alexander II attempted to restore order by issuing a special bull on the trade in relics in 1601. The document prohibited the sale of sacred objects without special permission from the bishop and established severe penalties for the manufacture of counterfeits. However, the bull had limited effect. The church administration simply could not control the huge market for relics. Moreover, it turned out that many bishops themselves were involved in the trade of dubious relics. Some church hierarchs received significant income from their relics and were not interested in strict control of their authenticity. Corruption penetrated all levels of the church hierarchy. The scandal involving the relics of St. Thomas Aquinas proved particularly scandalous. Shortly after the death of the great theologian in 1274, his relics began to spread throughout Europe. 50 years later, there were more than 20 heads of St. Thomas, dozens of hands, and hundreds of fingers. Mathematically, this meant that Aquinas was a multi-headed monster with several pairs of hands. Ordinary believers began to express dissatisfaction with the situation. The chronicles of that time contain records of how peasants refused to donate money for the purchase of relics, arguing that holy bones too often turn out to be dog bones. The authority of the church as an institution was seriously shaken. Medieval intellectuals also did not remain aloof from criticism. Pierre Abelard directly pointed out the absurdity of the situation with relics in his works. He asked, "If saints really possess divine power, why don't they protect their relics from desecration by merchants and forgers?" Critics also pointed out logical contradictions in the relic system. If a fragment of a relic has the same power as the entire body of a saint, why does the Church attach such importance to the size of relics? Why is a large fragment of bone priced higher than a small one? Does this not indicate that relics are viewed more as commodities than as sacred objects? By the end of the 11th century, it had become clear that the relic trade system was in need of radical reform. But the reform affected the interests of too many influential people, from Roman popes to village priests. And soon, events would take an unexpected turn that would further complicate the situation with the authenticity of Christian relics. The year 1095 forever changed the geography of Christian relics. When the Knights of the First Crusade took Jerusalem, they discovered a treasure trove of relics in the city that European Christians could only dream of. The Holy Sepulchre, Golgotha, and many places associated with the earthly life of Christ suddenly became accessible to Western conquerors. The Crusaders treated the shrines of Jerusalem as spoils of war. Every noble knight considered it his duty to take a piece of the Holy Land back to his homeland. A mass removal of relics from Jerusalem's temples began. Stones from the Holy Sepulchre, soil from Golgotha, fragments of the life-giving cross. All of this was transported to the West by the ton. The Venetians were particularly systematic in their actions. They not only participated in military operations, but also organized a real logistical operation to transport the relics. Venetian ships regularly sailed between the Holy Land and Europe, delivering precious cargo. Within a few decades, Venice became the largest European center for trade in Eastern relics. The Fourth Crusade of 1204 was the apogee of this sacrilegious enterprise. When the Crusaders captured Constantinople, they discovered a collection of relics that had been gathered by Byzantine emperors over 8 centuries. What happened next was called by contemporaries the greatest robbery in the history of Christianity. Knights and Venetian merchants methodically plundered the churches of Constantinople. They broke open reliquaries and removed the relics. Precious settings were melted down into coins, and the sacred objects were divided among the participants of the campaign. In a few days, priceless works of art were destroyed in Constantinople, and relics collected by the Byzantines over centuries were stolen. The treasury of Hagia Sophia was particularly affected. It housed the robes of the Virgin Mary, the belt of the Virgin Mary, and many relics of the apostles and martyrs. All of this was taken to the West and sold to European churches. It is believed that it was then that dozens of authentic robes of the Virgin Mary appeared in Europe. All of them came from the plundered Constantinople treasury. The massive influx of Eastern relics radically changed the European market for holy objects. Prices for ordinary Western relics fell sharply as demand shifted to more exotic Eastern relics. Many European monasteries, which lived off the income from pilgrimages, found themselves on the verge of bankruptcy. At the same time, the quality of the relics became even more questionable. The Crusaders were not experts in the field of holy relics. They took everything that was offered to them as valuable. Enterprising merchants in the East quickly set up production of fake relics specifically for Western buyers. Knights brought home tons of holy sand from Golgotha, which often turned out to be ordinary sand from nearby quarries. The church authorities tried to bring order to the chaos of relics brought from the East. Pope Innocent III issued several bulls requiring the authenticity of Eastern relics to be verified before they were placed in Western churches. However, it was practically impossible to control this process. The relics had already been distributed among thousands of churches and monasteries. The issue of duplicate relics proved particularly painful. Whereas previously there had been only one head of John the Baptist in Europe, in Rome, after the Crusades there were at least 5 such heads. Church theologians had to invent increasingly sophisticated explanations for such phenomena. The Crusaders brought back from the East not only the relics themselves, but also the Eastern traditions of their veneration. New types of reliquaries, borrowed from the Byzantines, appeared in Europe. The construction of Eastern-style temples, specially adapted for the display of relics, began. Gradually, a new geography of shrines took shape. Venice became the owner of the relics of the Apostle Mark, brought from Alexandria. Paris received the crown of thorns of Christ. Parts of the life-giving cross, brought by the Crusaders, appeared in various European cities. However, The most paradoxical consequence of the Crusades was that they discredited the idea of relics in the eyes of many contemporaries. People saw how sacred objects became the subject of trade and military spoils. If the relics of saints could be bought, sold, and seized by force, how were they any different from ordinary goods? Critical intellectuals pointed to the contradiction between Christian ideals and the actual practice of dealing with relics. Holy relics were supposed to remind people of spiritual values, but in practice, they stimulated greed, deception, and even military action. By the middle of the 13th century, it had become clear that the Crusades had forever changed attitudes toward relics. Relics had finally become commodities, and their spiritual significance had faded into the background. But the most serious upheavals for the cult of relics were yet to come, and they would be linked to the development of scientific thinking and the growth of skepticism in European society. By the 12th century, monasteries had become veritable corporations for the management of shrines. The abbeys of Saint-Denis, Cluny, and Sainte-Foy-de-Conques became not only religious centers, but also powerful economic empires built on the cult of relics. Every large monastery sought to acquire its own famous shrine, which would attract pilgrims and provide a stable income. Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis was the first to turn the management of relics into a high art. In the 1140s, he radically reorganized the presentation of relics in his monastery. The relics were placed in luxurious reliquaries made by the best jewelers in Europe. A special service was created to work with pilgrims. Routes for viewing the shrines were developed to ensure maximum visitor flow. Suger understood that relics were not only objects of worship, but also commodities that needed to be properly packaged and marketed. He commissioned detailed biographies of the saints, whose relics were kept in the abbey, organized regular celebrations in honor of the relics, and set up the production of souvenirs for pilgrims. During Suger's 20 years of rule, Saint-Denis's income increased fivefold. The success of Saint-Denis did not go unnoticed. Throughout Europe, monasteries began to copy the French model of managing shrines. Relic specialists appeared, monks who were exclusively engaged in the acquisition, authentication, and presentation of relics. These people understood the market for shrines better than any secular merchants. The monastery of Sainte-Foy-de-Conques, which possessed the relics of a young martyr of the 4th century, became particularly famous. The local monks created a real cult around Saint Foy. Dozens of miracles that occurred at her relics were recorded. Prayers and hymns were composed in her honor. Theatrical performances were organized to tell the story of her life and martyrdom. But the most ingenious move by the monks of Conques was the creation of a moving relic. They made a portable reliquary with a statue of Saint Foy and organized regular processions through the surrounding villages. Peasants who were unable to make a pilgrimage to the monastery could worship the shrine at home. Local residents paid generous offerings for such visiting services. Competition between monasteries for pilgrims gave rise to real holy wars. Abbeys spread rumors about the falseness of their rivals' relics, organized spectacular miracles, and poached pilgrims from each other. Some monasteries went so far as to steal holy relics from their competitors. A classic example of such holy theft is the story of the relics of Saint Nicholas. In 1087, Italian sailors from Bari stole the remains of the popular saint from the city of Myra in Asia Minor. The operation was planned as a commercial venture. Bari needed the famous relic to attract pilgrims and develop trade. The theft of the relics of Saint Nicholas became a model for imitation. Throughout Europe, monasteries began to organize expeditions for holy relics. Officially, this was called saving relics from infidels, but in practice, it was ordinary theft. The Venetians saved the relics of St. Mark from Alexandria, and the Genoese saved those of St. Lawrence from Rome. Monasteries developed sophisticated methods of authenticating their relics. Fake documents were created to confirm the antiquity and authenticity of the relics. Experts were invited, usually monks from other abbeys, who, for a fee, gave positive conclusions about the relics. Demonstrative miracles were organized to prove the power of the relics. Particular attention was paid to creating legends about the origin of the relics. The more romantic and incredible the story of the discovery of the relics, the more interest it aroused among pilgrims. Monastic chroniclers competed in inventing increasingly fantastic stories about miraculous finds of holy objects. The economic success of monasteries based on relics also had negative consequences. Many abbeys turned into commercial enterprises, where spiritual values took a back seat. Monks spent more time managing pilgrims than praying and studying the scriptures. Cultural centers became places not only of religious worship, but also of entertainment. Entire industries serving pilgrims formed around famous shrines. Hotels, taverns, souvenir shops, theaters. All this turned monasteries into medieval resorts. By the end of the 12th century, some monasteries controlled such significant financial flows that they could influence the politics of European states. Abbots of large shrines became influential political figures, and their opinions were taken into account by kings and popes. However, the more monasteries commercialized relics, the more questions arose about their authenticity. Critics pointed out, if shrines really have divine power, why is such sophisticated advertising necessary? Doesn't the commercial approach to relics indicate that they are seen primarily as a source of income rather than sacred objects? Soon, these questions would lead to a serious crisis of confidence that would threaten the entire system of veneration of relics in medieval Europe. By the 13th century, the Vatican had become the largest repository of Christian relics in the world. The papal residence accumulated relics from all corners of the Christian world, creating a unique collection that was unparalleled in scale and value. Each pontiff considered it his duty to replenish the Vatican treasury with new relics, turning Rome into a veritable Mecca for Christian pilgrimage. In 1243, Pope Innocent IV issued a revolutionary bull, according to which all the most significant relics of the Christian world were to be under papal control. This decision had both religious and political justifications. The Roman Church sought to centralize the management of shrines in order to prevent abuse and forgery. The Vatican treasuries were located in several buildings of the papal complex. The main collection was housed in a specially built repository under St. Peter's Basilica. Here, in underground chambers protected by massive walls, rested the most valuable relics of Christianity. Only the Pope and a few senior cardinals had access to these rooms. A special college of experts, the Sacred Congregation of Relics, was responsible for systematizing the Vatican relics. This organization, created in 1278, became the first scientific center in history dedicated to the study of Christian antiquities. Members of the congregation developed methods for verifying the authenticity of relics, compiled catalogs of relics, and studied their origins. The Vatican archives contained thousands of documents confirming the authenticity of various shrines. However, modern researchers have discovered that many of these documents were produced much later than the relics themselves. The papal chancellery systematically created historical evidence to legalize questionable shrines. The relics of the Passion of Christ occupied a special place in the Vatican collection. Fragments of the life-giving cross brought by Empress Helena, the crown of thorns given by French King Louis IX, and Longinus's spear found by the Crusaders in Antioch were kept here. Each of these relics was surrounded by special reverence and strict rules of access. The Vatican became an international center for the trade in relics, although officially the papacy condemned the commercial use of relics. In practice, however, the Roman Church actively participated in the exchange of relics with European monarchs and bishops. Relics became a diplomatic tool. Popes bestowed shrines on allies and denied opponents access to Vatican treasures. The procedure for authenticating relics in the Vatican was surrounded by special solemnity. When a new shrine arrived at the papal residence, a special commission of cardinals was convened. Prayers were held, documents were studied, and witnesses were questioned. In most cases, the relics were recognized as authentic. To reject a holy object would mean offending its donor. By the end of the 13th century, the Vatican's vaults contained the remains of virtually all the significant saints of Christianity. According to official catalogues, the relics of all 12 apostles, most of the martyrs of the first centuries, and many of the Church Fathers were kept there. Mathematically, this seemed impossible, but church theologians explained the phenomenon as a divine multiplication of relics. Pilgrimages to the Vatican brought the papacy enormous income. Worshipping relics was a paid service. A certain amount was charged for each relic. There was a complex system of tariffs. Viewing ordinary relics cost a few coins. Touching particularly revered relics cost dozens, and kissing the main relics cost hundreds of gold coins. Vatican jewelers created unique reliquaries that became works of art. The relics were placed in gold and silver caskets, decorated with precious stones and enamel. The cost of some reliquaries exceeded the cost of the relics themselves by tens of times. These works of art were displayed to pilgrims as evidence of the greatness of papal power. However, the success of the Vatican collection also gave rise to serious problems. The excessive concentration of relics in one place raised doubts among critically minded contemporaries. If the Vatican possessed the relics of all the saints, they wondered, what was left for other Christian centers? And where did such a large number of relics come from? The popes tried to explain the abundance of relics as divine providence. It was claimed that God specifically multiplied the relics of saints so that all believers could partake of their grace. However, such explanations did not satisfy everyone. The number of people who saw the Vatican collection not as a miracle, but as the result of systematic abuse, grew. By the beginning of the 14th century, criticism of the Vatican relics had become so acute that the papacy was forced to take defensive measures. Access to the main shrines was further restricted. Special services were created to combat critics of relics. But it was already impossible to stop the growth of skepticism. Too many doubts had accumulated over centuries of disorderly trade in shrines. The 20th century brought revolutionary changes in the study of Christian relics. What had been accepted on faith for centuries was suddenly subjected to rigorous scientific analysis. In 1908, Italian anatomist Giuseppe Ricci was granted permission to examine the Shroud of Turin, one of the most revered Christian relics. Ricci's research was the first serious attempt to apply scientific methods to the study of relics. The scientist discovered that the imprint on the shroud corresponded to the anatomy of a crucified man. but he was unable to determine the age of the fabric using precise methods. His work marked the beginning of a new field, scientific relic studies. The real breakthrough came in 1947, when American chemist Willard Libby developed the radiocarbon dating method. This technology made it possible to determine the age of organic materials with an accuracy of several decades. For the first time in history, it became possible to objectively verify the antiquity of sacred relics. The first radiocarbon studies of Christian relics yielded shocking results. In 1953, a group of British scientists examined a fragment of the life-giving cross from Westminster Abbey. Analysis showed that the wood had been cut down in the 11th century, 1,000 years after the crucifixion of Christ. Similar results were obtained when studying other fragments of the cross of Christ. German scientists analyzed wooden relics from 40 European cathedrals. None of them dated back to the 1st century AD. Most of the samples dated back to between the 10th and 14th centuries, a period of active trade in relics. The results of DNA analysis of human remains proved even more sensational. In 1984, Italian geneticists examined the blood on the Shroud of Turin. The DNA they found belonged to a woman of Mediterranean origin who lived in the Middle Ages. This totally contradicted the traditional view of the shroud as the burial cloth of Jesus. The research on the relics of St. Nicholas in Bari was particularly revealing. In 2009, an international team of scientists obtained permission to take bone tissue samples for analysis. DNA testing showed that the remains belonged to at least 3 different people who lived in different historical periods. Radiocarbon dating of the relics of St. Nicholas yielded even more unexpected results. The oldest bone fragments dated back to the 4th century, the time when the historical Nicholas of Myra lived. However, most of the remains were significantly younger, with some bones dating back to the 11th century, the time of their discovery in Bari. Scientific research on the relics of St. James in Santiago de Compostela yielded similar results. Anthropologists discovered that the silver reliquary contained the remains of several people of different ages and sexes. DNA analysis showed no kinship between the various bone fragments. The church authorities initially treated the scientific research with great suspicion. For a long time, the Vatican refused to provide samples of the relics for analysis, citing their sacred nature. However, pressure from the scientific community and the public forced the Church to change its position. In 1988, Cardinal Anastasio Balestrero authorized radiocarbon dating of the Shroud of Turin. The research was conducted simultaneously in 3 independent laboratories in Oxford, Arizona, and Zurich. All 3 analyses gave identical results. The shroud fabric was made between 1260 and 1390. The results of the scientific research sparked heated debate in the Christian world. Conservative believers rejected the scientific data, claiming that divine power could distort the results of any analysis. Liberal-minded Christians called for a rethinking of the attitude toward relics in light of scientific discoveries. Scientists continued to accumulate evidence of the medieval origin of most Christian relics. Studies showed that the peak of relic production occurred in the 11th to 14th centuries, a period of the Crusades and the heyday of the trade in relics. Virtually all of the relics analyzed turned out to be products of that era. Research on textile relics was of particular interest. Fiber analysis showed that most of the shrouds and coverings of saints were made from materials unknown in ancient times. Many fabrics contained dyes that only came into use in the Middle Ages. Modern technologies have made it possible to detect traces of artificial aging on many relics. Spectral analysis revealed the chemical compositions used by medieval forgers to give new objects an ancient appearance. These discoveries confirmed the scale of medieval production of fake relics. The accumulated scientific data painted a clear picture. The vast majority of Christian relics were made in the Middle Ages to meet commercial demand for holy objects. Very few authentic remains of early Christian saints have survived, and most of them cannot be reliably identified. The history of exposing fake relics is full of surprising and sometimes absurd discoveries. One of the most curious cases is the story of the milk teeth of Jesus, which were kept in several European monasteries during the Middle Ages. In 1457, the humanist Lorenzo Valla was the first to draw attention to the theological absurdity of such relics. Valla asked a simple question: if Christ was resurrected in the flesh, how could his baby teeth remain on earth? This logical paradox called into question not only specific relics, but also the entire theological concept of bodily resurrection. The church authorities hastily removed the milk teeth from public worship, but the scandal had already received widespread publicity. Even more sensational was the story of the exposure of the shroud of the Virgin Mary. By the 15th century, there were more than 50 different veils of the Virgin Mary in European churches. French theologian Jean Gerson conducted a detailed study of these relics and came to a shocking conclusion. If all the veils of the Virgin Mary were collected, their total area would cover several football fields. Gerson's mathematical calculations became a model for subsequent critical studies of relics. Scientists began to systematically analyze quantitative inconsistencies in the world of Christian shrines. It turned out that the Apostle Peter must have had at least 6 hands, judging by the number of his fingers stored in various churches. The story of the nails of the crucifixion proved particularly scandalous. In 1512, German theologian Martin Luther calculated that European churches held more than 300 nails from the cross of Christ. A maximum of 4 nails were needed to crucify one person. But medieval relic dealers clearly did not bother with arithmetic. Luther used the absurdity of the relic situation as one of his arguments against the Catholic Church. In his 95 Theses, he directly pointed to the trade in holy objects as a manifestation of church corruption. The Reformation of the 16th century was largely provoked by distrust of relics and their commercial use. Protestant theologians systematically exposed Catholic relics. Jean Calvin, in his treatise on relics, cited dozens of examples of obvious forgeries. He sarcastically noted that if all the fragments of the Holy Cross were collected, they would make up an entire forest, rather than a single instrument of execution. The Catholic Church was forced to respond to the criticism. The Council of Trent in 1545 to 1563 passed a decree on relics, which required stricter verification of the authenticity of shrines. However, these measures were more declarative in nature. Too many interests were tied to the trade in relics. In the 18th century, the Enlightenment brought a new wave of criticism of relics. Voltaire devoted a separate article to relics in his philosophical dictionary, full of biting sarcasm. He described a curious case in Lyon, where 2 heads of John the Baptist were displayed simultaneously, one adult and one child. Archaeological discoveries in the 19th century were particularly damaging to the reputation of relics. When scientists began to systematically study early Christian monuments, it became clear that many ancient shrines were of medieval origin. Analysis of construction techniques, ornaments, and materials ruthlessly expose the fakes. A classic example is the story of the Holy House in Loreto. According to legend, it was the hut of the Virgin Mary, miraculously transported by angels from Nazareth to Italy. Archaeological research has shown that the building was constructed in the 13th century from local materials that had no connection with Palestine. The 20th century brought even more accurate methods of exposing fakes. X-ray analysis of the relics of St. James in Santiago de Compostela showed that the reliquary contained the bones of various animals, including pigs and sheep. For centuries, pilgrims had been worshipping the remains of domestic animals. A curious case occurred with the blood of Saint Januarius in Naples. This relic was supposed to miraculously liquefy several times a year. Chemical analysis showed that the blood is a mixture of ferrous compounds that change consistency when the temperature and humidity change. Modern technology continues to expose medieval forgeries. DNA analysis of the relics of Saint Teresa revealed genetic material from several different people and even animals. Radiocarbon dating showed that the oldest fragments date back to the 17th century, 400 years after the saint's death. The story of Veronica, a veil with the imprint of Christ's face, is particularly telling. There were several competing versions of this relic in different cities. Spectral analysis of the dyes showed that all the imprints were applied by medieval artists using ordinary paints of the time. The accumulated data on forgeries is striking in its scale. Modern researchers have calculated that of the several thousand Christian relics that have undergone scientific analysis, only a few have been found to be authentic. Most of the relics are the products of medieval workshops that manufactured religious forgeries. The revelations continue to this day. Each new study brings fresh evidence that the world of Christian relics is largely based on pious deception. This poses a difficult question for believers. Which is more important, the historical authenticity of relics or belief in their miraculous power? In the 21st century, the trade in religious relics has gone underground, but it has not disappeared. Modern holy relics are sold through closed internet auctions, private collector networks, and underground dealer schemes. According to Interpol estimates, the annual turnover of the illegal trade in Christian relics ranges from $100 million to $200 million. The centers of the modern trade in holy relics are the major auction houses of London, New York, and Paris. Officially, church art and historical artifacts are sold here, but buyers are well aware that they are purchasing relics for religious use. Prices for such lots reach hundreds of thousands of dollars. The shadow trade is particularly active in countries with unstable political situations. Military conflicts in the Middle East have led to the mass looting of Christian monasteries and churches. Stolen relics are smuggled to Europe and America, where they are sold to collectors and religious communities. Syrian and Iraqi early Christian monuments have become real treasures for black archaeologists. In 2014, ISIS terrorists seized several monasteries in Mosul, from which they stole reliquaries and manuscripts that had been stored there for centuries. Many of these sacred objects subsequently appeared at European auctions. Modern technologies have facilitated the organization of illegal trade in relics. There are specialized trading platforms on the darknet where sellers offer holy relics, fragments of the cross, and other religious artifacts. Buyers can order delivery anywhere in the world through a network of couriers. The production of modern fakes of ancient relics occupies a special niche. In China and India, there are workshops that produce medieval reliquaries and ancient bones of saints. The quality of these fakes is so high that only serious expertise can detect the deception. Church authorities are trying to combat the illegal trade in sacred objects, but their capabilities are limited. The Vatican maintains a special database of stolen relics and cooperates with police in various countries. However, the scale of the trade exceeds the administrative capabilities of the Church. The scandal of 2007 was particularly painful for the Vatican when it was revealed that several cardinals were involved in the illegal trade in relics. High-ranking church hierarchs sold relics from the papal treasuries to private collectors, receiving multi-million-dollar bribes in return. Today's relic buyers are a motley crowd. They include religious fanatics who believe in the miraculous power of relics, cynical investors who view sacred objects as profitable assets, and wealthy collectors who want to own unique historical items. Prices for authentic relics are set based on their rarity, historical significance, and reputation for miraculous powers. An apostle's finger can cost $1 million. A strand of the Virgin Mary's hair, several $100,000, and a fragment of Christ's cross, tens of thousands. These prices are comparable to those of works by great artists. Relics associated with famous historical events are particularly popular. After the release of the film The Passion of the Christ, prices for all items related to the crucifixion rose sharply. The popularization of the cult of the Virgin Mary led to a boom in the trade of maternal relics. Modern fraudsters have developed sophisticated schemes to deceive buyers. Fake expert opinions are created, documents on the origin of relics are forged, and fake auctions are organized. Some dealers even hire actors to portray monks selling the family shrines of their monasteries. Online trade in relics has become global. Lots with saints' relics and fragments of the cross regularly appear on eBay and other trading platforms. Website administrators periodically remove such ads, but sellers quickly find ways around this. Law enforcement agencies in different countries have different attitudes toward the trade in relics. In some countries, it is considered fraud, while in others, it is considered normal commercial activity. The lack of uniform international standards makes it difficult to combat the illegal trade in sacred objects. Psychologists note that modern buyers of relics are often not interested in their authenticity. For many believers, it is not the historical authenticity of the relics that is important, but their symbolic value. This creates a steady demand for any items positioned as sacred objects. Economists predict further growth in the shadow market for relics. The secularization of society does not diminish but rather increases the value of religious symbols for certain groups of people. Relics become objects not only of faith, but also of prestige, investment, and collection. The modern trade in sacred objects is a complex ecosystem where religious, commercial, criminal, and psychological motives are intertwined. And this system continues to evolve, adapting to new technologies and changing market needs. In an era of secularization and scientific skepticism, the cult of Christian relics has not only not disappeared, but has taken on new forms. Modern pilgrimages to holy sites attract millions of people every year, bringing billions in revenue to religious centers. Lourdes is visited by 6 million pilgrims a year, Fatima by 5 million, and Santiago de Compostela by 300,000. The Catholic Church has learned to use modern marketing technologies to promote its shrines. Professional websites for pilgrimage centers are created, advertising campaigns are organized on social networks, and documentary films about miracles are produced. Relics are positioned as spiritual therapy, for modern people. Medical tourism to miraculous shrines is developing particularly actively. Cancer patients travel to the relics of Saint Rita in Cassia, those suffering from eye diseases to Saint Lucy in Syracuse, and infertile women to the belt of the Virgin Mary in the Vatican. The Church does not hinder such practices, receiving significant income from them. Modern technology has made it possible to create new forms of worship of relics. Virtual pilgrimages have appeared, online broadcasts of services at shrines, allowing people to participate in worship remotely. Some churches sell consecrated items online, claiming that they have come into contact with relics. The religious tourism industry has adapted to the demands of modern travelers. Pilgrimage routes are equipped with comfortable hotels, restaurants, and souvenir shops. Special tours are organized for different categories of pilgrims: youth groups, families with children, and the elderly. The example of Santiago de Compostela is particularly telling. The ancient way of Saint James has been transformed into a modern tourist product. A developed infrastructure has been created for pilgrims, including an electronic registration system, mobile applications with GPS navigation, and online booking of hostel rooms. Modern pilgrims are significantly different from their medieval predecessors. Studies show that only 30% of those walking the way of St. James are motivated by religion. The rest view pilgrimage as a sporting challenge, a cultural adventure, or a way to cope with a personal crisis. The Church is forced to take into account the changing needs of its audience. Light versions of pilgrimages are being created for people with limited physical abilities. Themed tours are being organized: historical, architectural, gastronomic. Pilgrimage centers offer additional services: yoga, meditation, psychological counseling. Social media plays a special role in the modern cult of relics. Pilgrims massively share photos of shrines on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. Special hashtags are created for each pilgrimage center. Influential bloggers receive sponsorship from church organizations to promote religious tourism. The commercialization of modern shrines has reached unprecedented levels. There are more than 200 religious souvenir shops in Lourdes. Plastic bottles of holy water, magnets with images of miraculous icons, and keychains in the form of reliquaries are sold. The annual turnover of trade in Lourdes exceeds €500 million. Modern medicine is skeptical about claims of miraculous healings at relics. However, psychologists recognize the positive impact of pilgrimage on the emotional state of believers. The placebo effect, group psychotherapy, and a change of scenery can indeed contribute to improved well-being. The Church has set up special commissions to investigate miracles at shrines. These organizations use scientific methods to verify reports of healings. However, the criteria for miraculousness remain highly subjective, and Church experts are much more liberal in recognizing supernatural events than their secular colleagues. Modern relics continue to multiply. New shrines associated with recently canonized saints are appearing. The relics of Mother Teresa, Pope John Paul II, and Padre Pio are actively distributed among Catholic churches around the world. The procedure for dividing relics has been worked out in minute detail. A special phenomenon is living relics, items that belong to religious leaders who are still alive. The Pope's clothes, the blood of famous stigmatics, the tears of clairvoyant elders. All of this becomes an object of worship even during the lifetime of their owners. The Internet has given rise to new forms of veneration of relics. Virtual shrines are being created where you can touch an image of the relics through the screen. Mobile apps are being developed for meditation in front of relics. Some churches offer VR immersion in holy places. Scandals surrounding the authenticity of many relics have had virtually no impact on the popularity of pilgrimages. Modern believers are often not interested in the historical authenticity of shrines. For them, it is the spiritual and symbolic value of relics that is important, not their archaeological authenticity. The economic significance of the cult of relics in the modern world cannot be overestimated. Religious tourism is one of the most dynamically developing sectors of the global economy. It provides jobs for millions of people, brings billions in tax revenues to states, and stimulates infrastructure development. In the modern Christian world, there is a growing number of believers who experience an internal conflict between religious tradition and scientific data about relics. Sociological studies show that 40% of practicing Catholics doubt the authenticity of most shrines, but continue to venerate them out of respect for tradition. This conflict is particularly acute among the educated part of the faithful. People with higher education who are familiar with the results of scientific research on relics find themselves in a difficult situation. On the one hand, they understand the absurdity of many claims about the authenticity of shrines. On the other hand, they do not want to break with the religious tradition of their ancestors. A typical example was the reaction of the Catholic community to the results of radiocarbon analysis of the Shroud of Turin. When the medieval origin of the fabric was proven in 1988, many believers refused to accept this data. Theories arose that scientific methods were not applicable to sacred objects. The church authorities found themselves in a delicate position. Complete rejection of the scientific data would discredit the church in the eyes of the educated public. Complete acceptance of this data would undermine the faith of ordinary believers in the miraculous power of relics. A compromise position was chosen. Science studies the material side of objects, but cannot comprehend their spiritual essence. Liberal-minded theologians offer various ways of reconciling faith with scientific facts. Some argue that the authenticity of relics is irrelevant. What matters is people's belief in their power. Others suggest viewing sacred objects as symbols rather than historical artifacts. Still others speak of the spiritual authenticity of relics, regardless of their material origin. Christian fundamentalists take a special position. They categorically reject any scientific data that contradicts church tradition. In their opinion, the very attempt to subject relics to scientific analysis is blasphemy. God can distort the results of any research to test people's faith. Most modern believers fall between these two extreme positions. They experience cognitive dissonance, psychological discomfort from the contradiction between their beliefs and the facts. Many resolve this conflict by ignoring uncomfortable information and focusing on the spiritual aspects of faith. An interesting study was conducted by American sociologists who studied attitudes toward relics among different generations of Catholics. Older believers, raised in a more traditional environment, tend to unquestioningly accept the authenticity of relics. Younger Catholics are more skeptical, but still view relics as important symbols of faith. The situation is particularly complex in Catholic families, where different generations have different attitudes toward sacred objects. Grandparents who have brought back consecrated items from pilgrimages do not understand the skepticism of their educated grandchildren. This leads to family conflicts on religious grounds. Modern priests often find themselves at the center of these contradictions. They must satisfy the needs of both traditionalists and skeptical parishioners. Many pastors avoid direct answers to questions about the authenticity of relics, preferring to talk about their spiritual significance. Psychologists note that doubts about the authenticity of relics can lead to a deeper crisis of faith. If the Church has been deceiving people about holy objects for centuries, what else in religious tradition can't be trusted? Some believers are beginning to rethink their convictions on other matters of faith. New forms of Christian spirituality have emerged that consciously distance themselves from the cult of relics. These movements emphasize personal relationships with God, the study of Scripture, and social service. Relics are seen as a relic of a superstitious past that is not in line with the modern understanding of Christianity. At the same time, there is an opposite trend: the growth of fundamentalism and traditionalism among some believers. These people respond to the crisis of relics by strengthening their belief in their authenticity and miraculous power. They create closed communities where critical thinking is not encouraged. The Internet has become a battleground between supporters and opponents of relics. Special websites are being created dedicated to defending the authenticity of holy relics. Pseudoscientific articles are being published refuting the data of radiocarbon analysis. Conspiracy theories are spreading that scientists are deliberately falsifying research results. Church leaders are trying to find a balance between tradition and modern realities. The Vatican continues to officially support the cult of relics, but is more cautious about recognizing new shrines. Special commissions are being created to apply scientific methods to verify miracles. Contemporary believers are developing individual strategies to overcome the contradictions between faith and knowledge. Some accept a symbolic understanding of relics. Others focus on their emotional impact. Still others simply avoid thinking about the subject. The evolution of attitudes toward relics reflects a broader process of religion adapting to the modern world. The Church must find ways to preserve its traditional identity without losing the trust of an educated audience. This is one of the main challenges facing Christianity in the 21st century. Within the modern Catholic Church, there is an invisible but fierce struggle between skeptics and apologists for relics. This discussion touches on the very foundations of Christian tradition and determines the future of the Church's relationship with holy objects. On the one hand, there are progressive theologians who call for honest recognition of the problems with the authenticity of relics. On the other are traditionalists defending the ancient foundations of faith. The leader of the skeptical movement is German theologian Cardinal Karl Lehner, who in 2005 published the sensational book Relics in the Age of Science. In his work, he stated outright that the Church should acknowledge the medieval origin of most shrines and reconsider its attitude toward the cult of relics. The book provoked a stormy reaction in the Catholic world. Lechner argued that continuing to worship obviously fake relics undermines the moral authority of the Church. If clergymen know about the fakes but remain silent, they become accomplices to the deception. Honesty towards believers must be a priority for the Church in the 21st century. Italian Cardinal Antonio Rossi, head of the Congregation for the Causes of Saints, took the opposite position. In his speeches, he asserts that the authenticity of relics cannot be established or refuted by scientific methods. Holy objects exist in the spiritual realm, which is inaccessible to materialistic science. Rossi develops the theory of the mystical authenticity of relics. In his opinion, if a relic has been the object of sincere worship for centuries, it acquires sacred properties regardless of its original origin. The prayers of millions of believers transform any object into a true relic. Between these two extreme positions, a third direction is forming, which can be tentatively called practical pragmatism. Its supporters suggest not focusing on questions of authenticity, but concentrating on pastoral work. The main thing is to help people with their spiritual needs, and relics can serve this purpose regardless of their origin. Particularly heated discussions have arisen around the future of the Shroud of Turin. Skeptics suggest honestly acknowledging its medieval origin, but preserving it as a significant religious symbol. Apologists insist on continuing research, hoping to find evidence of its authenticity. Pragmatists suggest focusing on its spiritual impact on believers. The scientific community is closely following these church debates. Many researchers are willing to cooperate with the church in studying relics, provided that the objectivity of the research is guaranteed. However, church authorities fear that too much scientific study of sacred objects could completely destroy their religious significance. The younger generation of Catholic priests is mostly skeptical. Having been educated in modern seminaries, where they study critical theology and biblical studies, they understand the historical conventionality of many church traditions. However, they often do not dare to openly express their doubts because of possible career consequences. Catholic universities play a special role in the discussion. Theology departments are becoming centers for the critical study of relics. Students write dissertations on the medieval trade in holy relics, analyze the economic aspects of pilgrimage, and study the psychology of religious belief. This research is shaping a new generation of church intellectuals. The Vatican is trying to control the discussion, but this is becoming increasingly difficult in the age of the Internet and academic freedom. The official position of the Holy See remains conservative. Relics are an important part of Catholic tradition and deserve veneration. However, behind the scenes, there is active debate about the future course of the Church. National Episcopal conferences take different positions on the issue of relics. German and Dutch bishops are more open to a critical approach. Polish and Italian hierarchs adhere to traditional views. The American Church is divided roughly equally between supporters of different approaches. Economic considerations also influence the discussion. Many church organizations derive significant income from pilgrimages to relics. Recognizing their authenticity could deal a serious blow to the financial situation of these institutions. Economic interests often outweigh theological considerations. The situation with local shrines is particularly telling. Small towns and villages whose economies depend on religious tourism are categorically opposed to any doubts about the authenticity of their relics. Local priests are under pressure from both church leaders and secular authorities. Modern media reinforce the polarization of opinions. Conservative Catholic publications publish articles in defense of relics, while liberal publications cover scientific exposés. Social networks are becoming a battleground between believers and skeptics. Algorithms reinforce echo chambers, where people only receive information that confirms their preconceptions. Psychological research shows that the conflict over relics reflects deeper processes in modern society. People are divided into those who are willing to rethink traditional beliefs in light of new data, and those who cling to familiar truths. Relics have become a symbol of this cultural divide. The future of the cult of relics largely depends on which position prevails in church debates. A skeptical approach may lead to an honest acknowledgement of problems with the authenticity of relics, but also to a crisis of faith among many traditionalists. An apologetic position will preserve the status quo, but risks discrediting the Church in the eyes of the educated public. Compromise solutions also have their risks. An ambiguous position may temporarily satisfy various groups of believers, but it will not solve the fundamental problem of the relationship between faith and knowledge. The Church faces a difficult choice that will determine its future in the modern world. International church organizations are trying to develop a common strategy on the issue of relics. The World Council of Churches is discussing the possibility of creating uniform standards for evaluating holy objects. However, reaching a consensus among different Christian denominations seems to be an extremely difficult task. Young theologians are proposing a radical rethinking of the entire institution of relics. In their opinion, the Church should focus on living testimonies of faith, acts of mercy, social justice, and spiritual growth. Dead bones cannot be the center of a living religion in the 21st century. Conservative circles respond that rejecting relics means breaking with 2,000 years of Christian tradition. Holy relics connect modern believers with the heroes of faith from the past. Destroying this connection will lead to spiritual impoverishment and the loss of historical memory. The battle of opinions within the Church is far from over. Each side has strong arguments and influential supporters. The outcome of this discussion will determine not only the fate of specific relics, but also the general direction of Christianity in the modern world. And it is still unclear which position will ultimately prevail. At the end of the second decade of the 21st century, humanity has reached a paradoxical situation. On the one hand, science has provided irrefutable evidence that the vast majority of Christian relics are medieval forgeries. On the other hand, millions of people continue to worship these shrines, receiving spiritual support and comfort from them. The philosophical question of the relationship between faith and evidence is not new to humanity. As early as the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas attempted to reconcile Aristotelian logic with Christian doctrine. However, when it comes to relics, this question becomes particularly acute. Can a relic that is not objectively authentic be considered genuine? Modern neurophysiologists are studying the mechanisms by which religious practices affect the human brain. Research shows that worshiping relics activates the same neural networks as other forms of deep meditation. The believer's brain reacts to the relic regardless of its historical authenticity. What matters is the sincerity of faith, not the archaeological authenticity of the object of worship. This phenomenon calls into question the very concept of fakes as it applies to religious objects. If a medieval reliquary has been the object of sincere faith for centuries, if saints have prayed at its relics, if it has comforted the suffering, does it not become authentic regardless of its original origin? Anthropologists point out that all cultures create sacred objects, endowing them with symbolic meanings. Australian Aborigines worship stones that Europeans consider to be ordinary minerals. But for Aborigines, these stones are the embodiment of ancestral spirits. Authenticity in this case is determined by cultural context, not chemical composition. The same logic applies to Christian relics. For a devout Catholic, a piece of wood from a medieval monastery can be a genuine fragment of the cross of Christ if he sincerely believes it to be so. Science can examine the material components of an object, but it cannot measure its spiritual significance. However, critics argue that such a relativistic approach blurs the lines between truth and falsehood. If we assume that any object can become sacred through belief in its holiness, then the criteria for distinguishing between genuine and fake relics disappear. This opens the door to all kinds of abuse and fraud. Church authorities are trying to find a compromise between these positions. The Vatican has developed a concept of levels of authenticity for relics. The first level consists of historically authentic shrines confirmed by scientific research. The second level consists of traditional relics that have been venerated for centuries but do not have strict proof of authenticity. The third level consists of symbolic relics, whose value lies in their spiritual significance. This gradation allows the Church to save face without completely rejecting problematic relics. However, for most believers, such subtleties are irrelevant. They worship relics without questioning their classification according to authenticity. Sociologists note that attitudes toward relics reflect broader changes in contemporary society. In the postmodern era, people are less inclined to trust authority and more inclined to create their own systems of meaning. For the postmodern consciousness, authenticity is a relative and contextual concept. The younger generation of believers often demonstrates a pragmatic approach to relics. They are not particularly interested in their historical authenticity, but value them as symbols of faith and tradition. For them, the emotional connection to the shrine is more important than its archaeological authenticity. Psychologists distinguish several types of attitudes toward the issue of relic authenticity. Naive believers accept traditional claims about sacred objects without critical analysis. Rational skeptics reject relics on the basis of scientific data. Symbolic believers value relics as significant religious symbols. Pragmatic agnostics are not interested in the question of authenticity, focusing instead on the practical impact of sacred objects. Philosophers of religion offer various models for understanding the phenomenon of relics in the modern world. Some speak of a double truth, scientific and religious, which exist in different spheres of human experience. Others propose the concept of functional authenticity. A relic is authentic if it fulfills its religious function. Economic aspects also influence the discussion of authenticity. The religious tourism industry built around relics generates billions in revenue. Recognizing the falseness of relics could seriously damage the economies of many regions. This creates powerful incentives to maintain the status quo regardless of scientific data. The future of relic worship will likely be determined not so much by scientific discoveries as by cultural and social processes. If society becomes more secular, interest in relics may naturally fade. If the need for religious symbols persists, relics will find new forms of existence. Technological innovations are already creating new opportunities for venerating shrines. Virtual reality allows people to touch relics remotely. Artificial intelligence can create personalized spiritual experiences. Perhaps in the future, digital relics will appear that exist only in virtual space. The question of the authenticity of relics remains open not only for the Church, but for all of humanity. It touches on fundamental issues of knowledge, faith, culture, and psychology. Perhaps it is more important not to find a definitive answer to this question, but to understand why it continues to concern people after 2 millennia of Christian history. Ultimately, each person must decide for themselves what is more important: scientific truth or spiritual need, historical authenticity or symbolic meaning, evidence or faith. And this choice will determine not only their personal spiritual life, but also the future of one of humanity's oldest religious traditions.